For decades, the deadliest thing in the ocean wasn't a shark, it was a heaving flight deck in a storm. Then, a Canadian invention called the Beartrap changed naval warfare forever. The U-boats were winning, but their greatest ally wasn't technology, it was the weather. And the invention that defeated the weather is one Hitler never saw coming. Hitler was certain his U-boats would starve Britain into submission. He forgot one thing: you can't stop the ingenuity of a sailor trying to get home. The open ocean in the dead of winter is a place of profound, terrible loneliness. When you stand on the deck of a small ship, a destroyer or a corvette, you are surrounded by a universe of gray, moving water. The waves are not like the waves you see at the beach. They are mountains, 60 feet high, that rise up and blot out the sky. Your ship, which felt so solid in the harbor, is now a toy, lifted, twisted, and dropped over and over with a sickening, metallic groan. Now imagine doing this not just for a day, but for weeks. Imagine you were surrounded by dozens of other ships, tankers and freighters, wallowing in the sea, carrying the lifeblood of a nation, the food, the fuel, the bombs, and the men to win a war. This was the Battle of the Atlantic, and you were the prey. Winston Churchill, a man who faced the Blitz without flinching, said that the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. He knew that if the Atlantic convoys stopped, Britain would starve. The war would be lost. Everything, absolutely everything, depended on these slow-moving ships making it from Halifax to Liverpool. And Adolf Hitler knew it too. His commander of submarines, Admiral Karl Donitz, had a simple, brutal strategy. He wouldn't attack the warships, he would sink the merchantmen. He would sever the artery. He believed he could sink ships faster than the Americans and British could build them. And in the early days of the war, during what the U-boat crews called the happy time, he was right. His U-boats, particularly the workhorse Type 7, were magnificent killing machines. They were stealthy, they had long range, and they carried a torpedo load that could cripple a 10,000-ton tanker in a single shot. But their real genius was not in the individual submarine, it was in the pack. Donitz organized his U-boats into wolfpacks. A line of submarines would spread out across the known convoy routes. When one spotted the smoke on the horizon, it wouldn't attack, it would radio the position to headquarters and shadow the convoy just out of sight. Then, as night fell, the other wolves would gather. They would close in, a dozen of them, and the attack would begin. They wouldn't even attack underwater. They would surface, in the dark, right in the middle of the convoy. A surface U-boat was small, fast, and almost invisible to the sonar of the day. For the sailors on the merchant ships, it was a vision of hell. A ship 2 columns over would suddenly erupt in a pillar of fire, lighting up the night. Then another. Men covered in burning oil would be screaming in the freezing water. The escorts, the few destroyers and corvettes guarding the flock, would race around dropping depth charges, but it was like hunting a ghost in a thunderstorm. By morning, the sea would be littered with wreckage, lifeboats, and the dead. The wolf pack would be gone. This was the crisis, and the Allies knew the solution. It was the same solution that helped defeat the U-boats in the First World War: air power. A submarine, even a U-boat, is a fragile thing. If it's caught on the surface by an airplane, it's a sitting duck. A few well-placed machine gun bullets or a shallow-set depth charge could rupture its hull and send it to the bottom. The problem was range. In the early 1940s, an aircraft could only fly so far. From bases in Newfoundland and Iceland, Allied planes could cover the western part of the Atlantic. From bases in Britain and Ireland, they could cover the eastern part, but in the middle, over 1,000 miles wide, there was a gap. A terrible, dark, 1,000-mile stretch of ocean where no Allied aircraft could fly. The U-boat crews called it the Black Pit. And it was here, in this gap, that the wolf packs feasted.
The Allies became desperate. They
They needed to get a plane in the air, right in the middle of the ocean. And their first solution was one of the most desperate gambles of the entire war. They created something called the cam ship. This was a catapult aircraft merchantman. They took a regular freighter, bolted a giant steam catapult to its bow, and perched a single Hawker Hurricane fighter on it. Think about what this meant. When a U-boat was spotted, or more often, when a German Condor spotter plane was seen radioing the convoy's position, this lone pilot would climb into his cockpit. He would be fired off the front of the ship like a slingshot. He would, with luck, shoot down the enemy plane or force the U-boat to submerge. And then, his mission was over. There was no way to land back on the ship. His only option was to fly until his fuel ran out, then ditch his aircraft in the freezing, violent ocean and hope. Hope that the convoy, which could not stop, would be able to spot him in the massive waves and fish him out of the water before he froze to death. It was a one-way ticket. Many of those pilots were never seen again. This was the price they were willing to pay. This is what Hitler was up against. Not just machines, but a generation of men willing to do the unthinkable. Of course, the cam ship was a stopgap, a desperate measure. The real solution was obvious: a floating airfield, a small aircraft carrier that could travel with the convoy. This was the birth of the escort carrier, the CVE. The Americans, with their industrial might, began stamping them out by the dozen. They called them Jeep carriers or Woolworth carriers. They were built on freighter hulls, they were slow, they were unarmored, and they were, without a doubt, one of the most important weapons of the war. With a Jeep carrier in the convoy, the Black Pit vanished. The moment a U-boat radioed a sighting, a flight of Grumman Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers would lift off that tiny deck and hunt. The hunters had become the hunted. But this solved one problem only to create a new one. The same one, in fact, that the cam ship pilot faced, just in a different form. How, in the middle of a North Atlantic gale, do you land a high-performance aircraft on a flight deck that is only 450 feet long? A full-sized fleet carrier like the Enterprise was a small city. An escort carrier was a postage stamp. And it was a postage stamp that was pitching up and down 30 feet, rolling 20 degrees side to side, and corkscrewing through the water. A pilot returning from a 4-hour patrol, exhausted, freezing, low on fuel, would look down at that deck and it wouldn't look like a ship. It would look like an animal, alive and trying to buck him off. If he came in too fast, he'd crash into the barrier. If he came in too slow, he'd stall and drop into the ocean. If he came in just right, but the ship dropped away beneath him, his landing gear would collapse. If the ship rose up to meet him, he would be slammed onto the deck with enough force to snap the plane in two. So how did they do it? They did it with pure, unadulterated skill and guts. And with one piece of very human technology, the landing signal officer, or LSO. This man, nicknamed Paddles, would stand on a small platform on the side of the deck, exposed to the wind and spray. He held 2 large paddles. He was not a traffic cop. He was a conductor. He was the pilot's eyes. The pilot would line up the ship, cut his power, and stop flying the plane. He would put his fate entirely in the hands of the LSO. The LSO, watching the plane's approach, watching the movement of the deck, would guide him in. A little high, little fast, you're low. And then, at the one perfect split second when the deck was relatively stable, he would give the cut signal, and the pilot would chop his throttle and drop onto the deck, hoping to catch one of the 3 arrestor wires. It was terrifying. It was crude. But it worked. It broke the back of the wolfpack. But this is where the story gets interesting. Because Hitler's underestimation wasn't just about one piece of gear. He underestimated a mindset, the mindset that sees an impossible problem and just keeps grinding until it's solved. The LSO and the arrestor wire were not the end of the story. They were the beginning. Because while landing on a heaving deck was hard, Finding the submarine before it attacked was just as difficult. The primary tool for this was ASDIC, what the Americans would later call sonar. It sent a ping of sound through the water and listened for the echo. It was a brilliant invention, but it had a massive flaw. It could tell you the bearing and range of a submarine, but it couldn't tell you the depth. Worse, the sonar beam was projected forward and downward. The closer you got to the submarine, the shallower the beam became, until, when you were right on top of it, the submarine was in a blind spot, directly beneath the ship. This was the moment of attack. The destroyer would race in at full speed, and the sonar operator would yell, "Lost contact!" And at that moment, the captain would guess where the U-boat was and roll his depth charges off the stern. A depth charge was a simple barrel of explosives. You set a hydrostatic fuse to explode at a certain depth, say 200 feet. But you were dropping it on a guess, and the U-boat, hearing the destroyer's propellers overhead, wasn't just sitting there. The captain was turning, diving, changing speed. By the time the depth charges slowly sank and exploded, the U-boat was often hundreds of yards away. It was a game of blindfolded luck. So the British invented Hedgehog. This was a mortar that fired 24 small contact-fused bombs in front of the ship. Now the destroyer could keep the U-boat on its sonar, race in, and fire before losing contact. The bombs would arc through the air and land in a wide circle, right where the U-boat was. And they only exploded if they hit something. There was no more guessing. A direct hit was a kill. Hitler underestimated the Hedgehog. But the U-boats adapted. They began attacking on the surface at night. In the dark, a surfaced U-boat was invisible, and ASDIC sonar was useless because it only looked under the water. The Allied radar of the time, working on a longer wavelength, was too primitive. It would show a large, fuzzy blob for the convoy, but a tiny U-boat? It was lost in the sea clutter, the echoes from the waves themselves. The U-boats, for their part, had a German-made detector called Metox. It could hear the Allied radar signals. The U-boat captain would be on his bridge, in the dark, and a little receiver would start to beep. He knew a ship with radar was nearby, long before they could see him. He could dive or slip away, untouched. So the Allies invented something new: microwave radar. H2S, or 10-centimeter radar. This new radar used a much shorter wavelength, which gave a crystal-clear picture. It could pick out a U-boat's conning tower from 5 miles away as clear as day. And the best part? The German Metox detectors couldn't hear it. They were deaf to this new frequency. Suddenly, U-boat captains who thought they were invisible were being hunted. Out of the dark, a plane would appear, dropping bombs. They were terrified. They called it the Rotterdam device, believing incorrectly that the British had stolen it from a new radar in that city. But the planes still had a problem. Once they spotted the U-boat on radar, they would dive in. In the final seconds, the U-boat would be too close to the plane and would disappear into that same sea clutter right below the aircraft. The pilot, blinded at the last second, would drop his bombs on a guess. So the British airman named Squadron Leader Humphrey de Verde-Lee had an idea. What if, in that final moment, you just turned on a light? He took a 22 million candle power searchlight, the kind used for anti-aircraft defense, and mounted it to a B-24 Liberator. Imagine the scene. A U-boat is on the surface, charging its batteries, thinking it's safe. The crew hears a plane, but their Metox is silent. Strange. They wait. Nothing. Then suddenly, at half a mile, the night is torn apart by a beam of light so bright it's like staring into the sun. The crew on the bridge is blinded, screaming, and in the belly of that light, the B-24 pilot can see every rivet on the U-boat's hull. He doesn't guess. He guides his depth charges right down their throat. This was the Leigh Light. It was a death sentence. Hitler underestimated the Leigh Light. But of all the things Hitler underestimated, the most important was not a machine. It was a secret.
He and all of his high command were absolutely convinced that their Enigma code machine was unbreakable. It was an electromechanical marvel that could scramble a message into 158 million possible combinations. They used it for everything, including sending Admiral Donitz's orders to his wolfpacks. They were wrong. At Bletchley Park, a secret estate north of London, a group of the world's most brilliant minds, mathematicians, linguists, and chess champions, were gathered, led by men like Alan Turing. They built one of the world's first computers, the bomb, for one purpose: to crack Enigma. They were helped by incredible acts of bravery at sea. In 1941, the destroyer HMS Bulldog captured U-110, finding its Enigma machine and codebooks intact. In 1942, two British sailors, First Lieutenant Tony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier, swam from their sinking ship to a sinking U-boat, U-559, to retrieve its codebooks. They were trapped and drowned as the submarine plunged, but they handed the books out just before it went under. They were awarded the George Cross posthumously. Their sacrifice saved thousands.
And in 1944, a U.S. Navy task force led by Captain Daniel Gallery, in a brilliant and daring operation, captured U-505 off the coast of Africa. They boarded the sub as it was scuttling, closed the seacocks, and captured the entire vessel, with its Enigma machine, codebooks, and torpedoes intact. That submarine, U-505, is on display in Chicago to this day, a monument to that victory. With these captured materials, Bletchley Park was able to read Donitz's mail. They knew where every wolfpack was, where it was going, and what its orders were. The convoys were simply routed around them. The effect was catastrophic for the U-boats. In Black May of 1943, the tide turned, permanently. In that 1 month, the Allies sank 41 U-boats. Dönitz, in a panic, had to pull his forces from the North Atlantic. He had lost the battle. He had even lost his own son, Peter, who died on U-954, sunk by an Allied plane that found it thanks to the codes. Hitler had underestimated the code breakers. He had underestimated the relentless, step-by-step grinding ingenuity of the Allies. They faced an impossible problem, and they solved it. They solved it with catapults, with guts, with mortars, with radar, with searchlights, and with mathematics. The Battle of the Atlantic was won. The lifeline was secure. The invasion of Europe could begin. But the story of that heaving deck, that central problem of man against the sea, was not over. In fact, its most ingenious solution was yet to come. When the Second World War ended, a new, colder war began. The enemy was no longer the Type 7 U-boat. It was the Soviet nuclear submarine. This was a different animal entirely. The German U-boats were really just submersible torpedo boats. They spent most of their time on the surface and dove only to attack or escape. They were loud, they leaked oil, and they were limited by the air in their crew's lungs and the charge in their batteries. A nuclear submarine, like the ones the Soviets began building in the 1950s and 60s, was a true submarine. It was, as Tom Clancy would write, a ship of the line. It made its own power and its own air from the sea itself. It could travel at 30 knots underwater, faster than most of the surface ships hunting it. It could stay submerged not for days, but for months. And it was quiet, a whisper in the deep. Worse, these new submarines weren't just threatening cargo. They were threatening civilization. They carried nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles. A single Soviet boomer sub hiding off the coast of Virginia could incinerate Washington, New York, and Boston in 15 minutes. The hunt was on again, and the stakes were apocalyptic. The old tools wouldn't work,
An escort carrier was too slow to keep up with a modern carrier battle group. The destroyers and frigates, the new fast escorts, had sonar. But the Soviets were masters of the deep. They learned to hide in thermal layers. The ocean isn't one uniform temperature. It's layered, like a cake. A layer of warm water might sit on top of a layer of very cold water. And that boundary, that thermocline, acts like a mirror to sonar. A destroyer could be pinging, searching, and a Soviet submarine could be hiding right underneath that layer, completely invisible. The sonar waves would just bounce off the top. The Allies, now NATO, needed a way to get below that layer. They needed a weapon that would hunt a sub that was faster than their own ships. They needed air power all over again. But this time, it wasn't a plane. It was the helicopter. The helicopter was the perfect anti-submarine weapon. It could take off from a ship, fly to a suspected location, and then hover. It didn't need a runway, and it could carry a dipping sonar, a sonar transducer on a long cable. It could lower that sonar below the thermal layers, listening in the cold, silent deep. If it found the sub, it could drop a homing torpedo right on top of it. The Kaman Sea Sprite, the Sikorsky Sea King, these were the new submarine killers.
But they brought back that old, terrible problem, the heaving deck. In fact, the problem was worse. An escort carrier was a postage stamp, yes, but a modern frigate or destroyer? Its flight deck was the size of a speck of dust, and it was just as violent. In the North Atlantic, or the WWII gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK, the seas were just as bad as they were in 1943. We are talking about state of sea 5, waves 12 to 20 feet high. The ship is pitching, bow and stern slamming down. It's rolling 25 degrees side to side, and it's yawing, fishtailing left and right. Now, imagine you are the pilot of a 10-ton Sikorsky Sea King. You are trying to land this multi-million-dollar machine packed with sensitive electronics and explosive torpedoes onto a space not much bigger than a 2-car garage, a garage that is moving in 3 dimensions, all at once. This was the limbo problem. The pilot would maneuver over the tiny deck, hovering, say, 15 feet above it. He'd wait for the deck to rise, but just as he started to descend, the ship would fall away into a trough. Suddenly, he's not 15 feet above the deck, he's 35 feet in the air, caught in the turbulent burble of wind coming over the ship's hangar. His helicopter, already unstable, would be kicked sideways. He'd fight to regain control, overcorrecting, burning fuel, his heart pounding. Landing was a nightmare. It was restricted to the calmest seas, and the Soviets knew it. The subs could operate in any weather. The helicopters, their deadliest enemy, were grounded. Many attempts were made to solve this. Some navies tried nets, big, massive nets to catch the helicopter. It was as crude as it sounds and often damaged the aircraft. The French tried a grid system with harpoons, but the pilot had to hit a tiny target perfectly. The problem seemed, for a time, to be unsolvable. You simply could not safely and reliably operate a large helicopter from a small ship in high seas. Until the Canadians solved it. The Royal Canadian Navy, more than perhaps any other, lived in the North Atlantic. Their entire purpose was anti-submarine warfare in the worst weather on Earth. This problem was not academic for them, it was their daily reality. In the 1950s, an engineer at Ferry Aviation of Canada named C.H. Bud Budge became obsessed with the problem. He and his team realized the central flaw. The pilot was trying to land a moving object on a moving target. What if, they asked, you could connect the two before the landing? What if you could force the helicopter to move with the ship perfectly? They developed a system, and it was so ingenious, so counterintuitive, and so effective that it changed naval aviation forever. They called it simply the Beartrap.
The title of this video is Hitler Underestimated Anti-Sub Tech Until Beartrap Hauldowns Secured Atlantic Convoys. And as we've seen, the Beartrap itself didn't come along until 20 years after Hitler was gone. But the spirit of the title is absolutely true. Hitler, and later the Soviets, underestimated this relentless drive to solve the impossible. The Beartrap is the final, brilliant chapter in the story that began on those desperate convoy runs. So, how does it work?
It is a masterpiece of engineering. It's a dance between the pilot, the deck crew, and a remarkable machine. First, the pilot doesn't try to land. He flies his helicopter to a precise hover, about 20 feet above the heaving flight deck. He is guided by the landing signal officer who, just like his WWII predecessor, is watching the aircraft and the sea. From the belly of the helicopter, a light messenger cable is lowered. A two-man team on the deck, braced against the wind and spray, runs out and grabs it. This is an incredibly dangerous job. They call it the giggle factor, because if you aren't scared, you're crazy. They connect this light line to a much heavier half-inch steel cable, the main Hauldown cable. This cable runs from a powerful winch deep inside the ship, up through the center of the flight deck. The helicopter pilot then winches this heavy cable up, and a mechanism in the helicopter's belly marries it, locking it into place. Now, think about what has happened. The helicopter, still flying, is physically attached to the ship. The landing officer is watching his instruments. He's watching the roll and pitch indicator of the ship. He waits. The deck rolls to port. It rolls to starboard. It finds a momentary lull, the still point in the storm. He gives the signal. Haul down. A crewman at a control station hits a button. The powerful hydraulic winch springs to life. With thousands of pounds of force, it begins to pull the helicopter out of the sky. It hauls it down, hard and fast, faster than the ship can drop away. The pilot, for his part, keeps his collective up, keeps his rotors pulling, flying the helicopter all the way down. He is flying, but he is also being pulled. He is no longer fighting the sea. The ship and the helicopter are one system, moving together. In the center of the deck is the trap itself. It's a metal grid split down the middle. As the helicopter is hauled down, a long probe extending from its belly enters this grid. The instant that probe is seated, the LSO gives the trap signal. The operator hits another control. The two halves of the grid slam shut like a bear trap, clamping onto the probe. And in one jarring, violent clack, the 10-ton helicopter is secured. It is locked to the deck, immovable. The pilot can finally, with a sigh of relief that is felt through his entire body, cut his power. From total, chaotic instability to perfect, rigid stability in 1 second. This invention was a revolution. It meant that a frigate, a destroyer, any small ship could operate a large, powerful anti-submarine helicopter in almost any weather. The subs had lost their last sanctuary. They could no longer hide in a storm. The Beartrap, or RAST as it's known in the U.S. Navy, became the standard for nearly every NATO navy. The SH-60 Seahawk, the British Lynx, the Canadian Sea King, all of them became the submarine's worst nightmare precisely because the Beartrap allowed them to be. It's an incredible piece of problem solving, and if this kind of deep dive into military history and technology is what you enjoy, subscribing to the channel is the best way to let us know. It truly helps us decide what stories to tell next. When we look back at the Battle of the Atlantic, it's easy to see it as a simple, brutal equation. Hitler's math was sink more tonnage than the Allies can build. Donitz's math was U-boats versus merchant ships. But they were wrong. The equation was never that simple. It was ingenuity versus tonnage. It was persistence versus destruction. Hitler and his admirals saw the Atlantic as a battlefield. The Allies saw it as a problem to be solved. A series of problems. Problem? The Black Pit. Solution? Escort carriers. Problem? Landing on them. Solution? LSOs and arrestor wires. Problem? Sonar blind spot. Solution? Hedgehog mortars. Problem: night attacks. Solution: microwave radar. Problem: last-second blindness. Solution: the Leigh Light. Problem: unbreakable codes. Solution: Bletchley Park. Every time the U-boats adapted, the Allies innovated. They failed and failed and failed again until they succeeded. The men who flew those hurricanes off the cam ships, the men who drowned retrieving the Enigma codes from U-559, they were all part of this. And 20 years later, when a new, more terrifying submarine threatened the world, that same spirit was alive in Bud Budge and the Royal Canadian Navy. They looked at that same impossible problem, a heaving deck in a North Atlantic gale, and they solved it. They solved it with a cable, a winch, and a trap. The line from a WWII depth charge to a Cold War Beartrap is unbroken. It's a line of persistence, of ingenuity, of refusal to accept that a problem is unsolvable. That is what Hitler truly underestimated. He didn't just underestimate technology. He underestimated the human spirit's capacity to build, to adapt, and to overcome, even when faced with the cold, terrible, lonely power of the sea. The story of the Beartrap is just one of many, and the story of the WWII tech that came before it, like the Hedgehog, is just as fascinating. We hope you'll continue to join us for these remarkable stories. Thank you for spending this time with us.